Hello YouTube, welcome back. As you probably noticed, it's been quite some time since I last recorded one of these cello chat episodes. But I wanted to do this one because in the last few days I have found myself having quite a lot of conversations with people around one particular topic, and that is how hard is it actually to learn to play the cello? So I thought we would talk about that in quite some depth. After the Paris Olympics last year, the British polling company YouGov conducted a survey amongst British adults asking a simple question. Do you think that if you started training in any Olympic sport of your choice today, you could qualify for a slot at the 2028 Olympics in LA? And I have to say, when I saw the results, my chin dropped somewhat because no fewer than 28% of respondents thought that they could, with the most frequently cited sports including shooting an air rifle, badminton, rowing, table tennis, swimming, and believe it or not, even the 100-meter sprint was cited there. So, are my fellow countrymen and women just incredibly overconfident? Well, that made me think a little bit. And I came to the conclusion that I think whenever we see someone absolutely at the top of their game do something with such apparent ease, it obviously lures us into a completely false perception of how easy or hard it is to do something. And to illustrate that a little bit further, I will tell you now a little bit about how I started to play the cello. Even though I come from a very musical family, my late father having been a professional cellist himself, my grandfather having been a professional double bassist, my parents never, when I was a young child, put me into sort of structured musical training as perhaps you would expect. All I did was that from about the age of, I think, 8, I started to teach myself really to play the piano. Never had any lessons, and over the course of a few years, looking back at it now, knowing what I know now, I actually managed to progress to quite a high level. And it was only when I was about 11 or so that my parents said, well, do you maybe want to learn another instrument? And because there happened to be some small cellos standing around, so that probably was the most obvious choice. And up until, I mean, 12 is already quite old. You have already got a completely different level of awareness. You're not a small kid anymore that sort of doesn't really think much, and you just kind of do as you're told. So there I was, and at that age, up until that point, I think looking back, I had never really sort of come across anything that I had found particularly difficult. I was doing very well in school, academically, without what I would have perceived as any kind of effort. Still don't know why, but and the same, with a piano, I sort of managed to teach myself quite easily. So naturally, I assumed that if I started another instrument, of course, especially Dad being a cellist, I thought, well, I must be good at that, and I was just going to pick that up and continue getting my gold stars. Oh boy. Well, that was a revelation right then and there, because I think that was the first time in my life that I had met my match. And I I wasn't just, automatically good at that. It wasn't something I could just pick up and, here we go, go and play. So that was actually, quite a bitter pill to swallow. But at the same time, I was also far too, sort of proud and determined and simply bloody minded to just say, okay, actually, I'm going to give that up, and then, can't be bothered with that. No. There was something deep inside me that kind of felt, okay, actually, I want to get good at this. I'm going to find a way to get good at this. And so I started to work. I started to work really, really, really hard. But I was doing it really with the, what I would sort of, we call in England the, throw the kitchen sink at it approach. I was just, doing a lot of hours, but I wasn't thinking, particularly deeply about how I was doing it or what I was doing. But nonetheless, within the course of really from starting, from scratch to getting into music college, I managed that within the space of 4 or 5 years, which is a very, very short space of time. But needless to say, once I got there, I was there with a lot of people who had been trained properly from a very, very young age. So, it was, even though, I'd made it to that level, it was still a very, very, very humbling experience. So, but then as I became a student, something else happened. And obviously being a student, you are perpetually broke. And I was absolutely no exception to the rule. So I had to find any way I could to, support myself, make money. And so I started teaching little kids quite early on. I think I'd only just turned 19 when I started. And that was the game changer for me. And I'm going to tell you why. When you start teaching and you have someone in front of you who has never played the cello, knows absolutely nothing about it, you're suddenly thrust into a situation where, well, okay, you now have to articulate how to do absolutely everything. How do you hold that instrument? How do you hold the bow? How do you create a sound? How does this work? How does that work? And I think for me, that was perhaps the first time that I started to really consciously think about each one of these individual topics, each one of these individual processes. And funny enough, I found very, very quickly that I enjoyed that hugely, because I think I've always been someone who very much needed to understand why something works the way it works. So even I remember in school, in mathematics or something, I had to understand, why does that formula work the way it works? I had to understand those nuts and bolts. And that was the same really with the cello. And I think perhaps up until that point, I don't think any of the teaching I had was really that sort of super structured. There was a lot of information, but, it was perhaps all a little bit broad brush. And suddenly, there was every minute little detail. I was obviously, when you have a student in front of you, you see every single mistake. You see, okay, that doesn't look right, that doesn't sound right, that's on tune. And obviously sometimes then you finish a lesson and you go home and you go like, oh, hang on a second, well, let's just make sure that I'm not doing any of these things. And well, I probably don't need to tell you that 9 times out of 10, you know, you take a good look and you find something that you shouldn't be doing. So that was really for me a complete turning point, and I immersed myself into really reading and, you know, studying really, you know, especially really string teaching. And the more I looked into that, the more I tried all of these different things, I suddenly noticed that I myself, my playing was starting to take off big time. And then obviously, you know, later on with the sort of early advent of YouTube, for instance, we started to have much more access to, you know, information. Suddenly, you know, you could actually watch, you know, how as a, you know, lots of really great players, you know, teach, and that became for me something which I became absolutely obsessed with, you know, and I would, you know, lots of players and, you know, colleagues I admired, I was constantly studying what they were doing, you know, how they were doing it. I would ask endless questions, and that was really what, you know, fueled my passion for teaching, for what it is that, you know, you are seeing on your screens now on my channel. So that was really for me the complete game changer, and I think the thing that ultimately for me linked the playing and the teaching so closely together. Today I couldn't really do one without the other. Now, why am I telling you this whole story in this context? Because playing the cello, in my experience, was extremely difficult if you just try to pick up a cello and just go for it and just do it. If you try to do that, you will very quickly find yourself hitting a brick wall. And that is certainly something, hitting brick walls, which I sort of in the early years experienced quite a lot. So coming back to the to where we started, the you know, what does it take to qualify for a slot in the Olympics? I think when we see someone, you know, run a 100-meter race, the one thing that I think probably more than 90% of people watching that race have got very little knowledge of, or even appreciation for, is the fact that those runners running the actual 100 meters is probably less than 5% of their training. What you don't see is that this product of that 100-meter race involves 1,000 small individual processes. Each one of them has to be done to the highest possible level, and many of them, the most basic ones, have to be done day after day after day. It's not that, you know, you look at, I don't know, Usain Bolt, and, you know, that he just, you know, managed to get up in the morning and decide, you know, okay, today, you know, I'm going to run a world record. No, of course not, because what goes into that is hours and hours and hours and hours in the gym, doing weight training, doing cardio, you know, millions of, you know, along the way of specific exercises to train, you know, getting a better start, getting better acceleration, getting better form. It's a never-ending process. And of course, that is exactly the same on an instrument. And I think where very, very often people really get to the point of just feeling they can't make any progress is the fact that they simply try to pick up the instrument and almost, from day one, try to learn pieces that actually, in order to play these, you need to have done years and years and years of groundwork to actually learn all the individual things that go into that. And of course, especially when someone's trying to teach themselves, I think that is perhaps where, the ability to teach yourself is limited, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know in what order you have to learn these skills in order to actually build a foundation. It's ultimately not that easy to gauge whether you are really doing something right or not. And but for me, the one thing I have to say that frustrates me quite greatly often is that it's not just when I have students coming to play to me for the first time, especially, that it's not just students who are self-taught, where of course you can explain that, but that even people having lessons often clearly in their lessons have skipped over vast amounts of absolutely fundamental skills that you need to master if you want to have anything to build on. And of course, I think it's doing the realization that you have to do extremely detailed, what I often call donkey work on, you have to put the time in and do, work on the open strings. You have to spend ages, learning how to get a good bow hold. You have to spend ages, learning to get a good left hand shape, how to do a shift right, how to do everything. Of course, that work isn't sexy. That work is not sexy. That is really daily, daily grind. And I think some of the most difficult, perhaps the most difficult aspect of teaching is that very, very often when someone comes to me for the first time, I have to have a very difficult conversation. And that is to say, you're going to have to go backwards in order to go forwards. I.e., if I see that there are massive holes in someone's sort of fundamental technique, you have to fill those holes if you want to have any chance of moving forward. It is as simple as that. And I think ultimately I find myself, I can say that, the emphasize the importance of basics, in all the videos I do over and over and over and over and over again. But I've seen over many years in my teaching practice, and I think the vast majority of us, we all hope deep inside that, I'm special. I can probably, I can probably skip a bit of that, can't I? Sort of, wink, wink. The answer is no. The answer simply is no. And at the stage of having that conversation, I'm not going to lie. Some people aren't willing to engage with that. They don't fancy doing that, and they will go on to someone else and someone else until they hope they find someone who will tell them they won't have to do that, and that's totally fine with me. But the pupils I have now who have really engaged in that process, to see their progress is absolutely amazing. Because even if you are, let's call it a late starter, and you started sort of well into adulthood, you can actually make very, very good progress and become very proficient, a very proficient player, certainly, able to really enjoy your playing, and maybe join your local amateur orchestra and have play with people and have a great deal of fun and enjoyment with it. But the way to get there is paved with structure and with detail. So for instance, on my channel, I did a video a few months ago where I said, okay, the skills that you need to learn sort of within the first year of playing, and the order in which ideally you want to you want to learn those, and that is and those are the kind of tools I put out there, really to help people, especially who are teaching themselves, to give some kind of structure. That's sort of how, if you want to really do it properly and see results, that is kind of the blueprint to follow. So coming back to our very original question, is playing the cello difficult? And yes, of course, if you're starting from nothing, the first time you actually try to get a note out of the instrument, realize how incredibly difficult that is. You think, well, I'm never ever going to get there. However, what we want to focus on is incremental gains, small incremental gains. Very often people ask me, okay, so what should my goal be? And my answer is always the same. Do every little thing, every element of your playing a little bit better today than you did it yesterday. And for as long as you follow that, for as long as you have the patience, patience is absolutely crucial. Patience, playing the cello ultimately is perfectly achievable for the vast majority of people, and playing the cello well is achievable, provided you have patience and you have a great degree of discipline. I can tell you from, I told you about it links earlier, the just through the kitchen sink approach doesn't get you very far. You hit the wall very, very, very quickly. But if you break it down into lots and lots and lots of small chunks, which is obviously what I'm trying to do here in my videos, you really try to every single day get a little bit better at each of them, you will see results very quickly. And in my experience, even those people who initially were really not very keen to embark on the let's go back to go forwards journey, the moment they have done a few weeks of what I call the donkey work, and suddenly they can hear a lovely sound, they hear how much they have improved, their motivation goes through the roof, and they have well and truly been converted to doing detail. So, in conclusion, yes, of course, playing the cello isn't easy, but I'm here to help you make it as easy as possible. And every day a little bit, and you'll get there. See you soon.